Decades of housing discrimination have helped create an enormous wealth gap between white and black families.
The enduring legacy of redlining, the legal government-sponsored effort to deny mortgages and home ownership opportunities to African Americans and other minorities, continues to undermine their quality of life. This violation of basic civil rights continues to negatively impact educational attainment, health outcomes, wealth accumulation, self-esteem, mortality rates, and civic engagement. Homeownership has proved to be both the doorway and gatekeeper to success and well-being in America. It is at the core of today's racial wealth gap.
There's a very powerful myth in this country, and that is that residential segregation in this country is something we call de facto segregation. Something that happened by accident. Every textbook that's used in American high schools and middle schools today lies about this history. It talks about how northern cities were de facto segregated without government involvement. They talk about how the Federal Housing Administration did a wonderful job of creating single-family homes in the suburbs for working-class families, without mentioning that the working-class families that created these homes for could only be white.
This began a history of excluding people of color from government housing programs. Intended to lower the cost of mortgages and increase home ownership. Segregated neighborhoods by race using a code system. Outlined minority neighborhoods using the color red. Intended to expand the secondary mortgage market by securitizing mortgage loans. Community boards often denied minority veterans mortgages. Many minority vets could not be buried in the same cemetery as whites. It wasn't until 1970 that lending to communities of color began to increase.
The way this manifested itself was through the drawing of maps. Different neighborhoods were underwritten as being riskier or safer, and the principal component that determined riskiness or safety from a lending standpoint was ethnic and racial composition.
It was at that point that the real estate developers began to drop strings around areas. The local banker could choose who would get mortgages, where, so that we could not have gotten a loan out in the suburbs because those were whites only. The concept of a middle-class black only exists in the mind of a middle-class black. Everywhere else in the suburbs, you are that nigger family on the corner of Warren Road and Boulevard Way.
Well, the truth is that we've had in this country generations of affirmative action for whites. And the sad truth of it is that whites don't know that that's happened, or they refuse to accept it, or don't understand the history. And what that leads to is this false kind of narrative that I did it myself. You know, this Horatio Alger individual responsibility narrative.
There were many federal, state, and local policies explicitly racial, designed to create segregation in every metropolitan area in the country, and policies that were so powerful that they still determine the racial boundaries of metropolitan areas today. The Federal Housing Administration began a program to suburbanize the entire white working-class population into single-family homes.
This is Levittown, Pennsylvania, a new suburban community of 60,000 people with its giant shopping center, winding lanes named for flowers and trees. It is fairly typical of communities all over America, where families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life. Nearly all are young people. A large proportion are veterans. For many, it is the first house of their own, and it represents a major financial investment. In August 1957, Levittown, Pennsylvania attracted international attention as William Myers Jr. and his family moved into the 3-bedroom house. They're very close to the Levittown norm, except in one respect. William Myers Jr. and his family are Negroes in an all-white community.
If more colored are allowed to move in, Levittown is going to go downhill.
The only way that those developers could get the capital to do that was by going to the Federal Housing Administration. In order to get that approval, they had to commit never to sell a home to an African American.
Access to leverage allowed middle-class whites to build wealth.
The white families who bought those homes were able to use their wealth to send children to college, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children, who could use it as down payments for their own homes.
Restricted covenants ensured that minorities could not buy into white neighborhoods. Properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes.
When Karen and I purchased this home that was built in 1948, we found some documents in a closet. Neither the whole or any part of said tract shall be sold, rented, or leased to any persons or persons not of white or Caucasian race.
Created greatest growth of the middle class in the history of the world. In 1940, 42% of white families owned their own home. In 2000, 71% of white families owned their own home.
So consequently, that those 71%, 72% of white homeowners who own their own home should be thankful to the federal government for providing them this opportunity. What did not happen, or what happened at the same time, was that we, people of color, were discriminated against and were prevented from taking advantage of those opportunities.
The recent housing and foreclosure crisis were a continuation of a form of redlining. Financial institutions practiced unrealistic credit scoring and predatory lending. Subprime mortgages grew nearly 250%. In 1998, subprime mortgages made up 9.8% of the mortgage market. By 2006, they made up 23.5% of the market.
And the gap between white homeownership rates and black homeownership rates is 30 percentage points larger than it was back in 1968. In 1968, the typical black family had 1/6 as much wealth as the typical white family. Now it is 1/10. We have gone backwards since the civil rights era.
Latinos lost close to $170 billion worth of equity that they had accumulated in the home that they purchased many, many years before then.
When they come to access products, the choices that they're given are limited. So you're given, instead of conventional loan, you're given a special loans that have higher interest rates or higher fees that again set you up for foreclosure or failure as well.
The scandal of your tenure is your unwillingness to do your job and enforce the laws that reduce housing discrimination.
The housing crisis affected all communities, but disproportionately devastated minority families. Black and Hispanic families lost nearly 20 years of wealth between 2007 and 2013. Minority home ownership is the lowest it's been since 1996.
Redlining discrimination in the Asian American community is live and kicking. And in California, you'll see that Asians had the second highest probability of going to foreclosure, very comparable to Latinos. So Latinos were 1.4, for Asians it was 1.3. And so whether it is in homeownership, rental, small business, foreclosure, across the board, there is redlining.
Between 1934 and 1962, $120 billion in FHA and VA loans were issued. Over that period of time, 98% of the loans went to white families, and less than 2% went to African Americans and other minorities. Using the average home price index between 1934 to 2018, Those FHA VA loans equates to at least $3 trillion in current real estate value. Assuming that as loans were paid off and excess funds were invested in stocks and other investments, conservatively, another $2 trillion were created. This white subsidy is the major contributor to the current racial wealth gap.
So many white Americans experience this sense of self-esteem, this sense of superiority, if you will, this sense of mastery, that they have created their own destiny in their lives, and they have no acknowledgement of this invisible hand that supported them throughout their lives, and not just them, but there's a legacy of that invisible hand across generations that has translated itself from the original affirmative action to trillions of dollars of a head start ahead of other communities like African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, others who don't have the same benefit.
Children of homeowners are more likely to graduate from high school, have less childhood behavioral problems, and achieve higher college graduation rates.
In segregated housing and in neighborhoods that are thereby segregated, that tend to be low-income neighborhoods, there is the greater likelihood that the youngsters will be involved in gangs or will be recruited to be in gangs.
I noticed an absence of hope, an absence of light. These kids were barraged with a message every single day of their lives that they weren't valued, that they didn't matter. And they internalized that. And that caused frustration and anger and eventually despair and a loss of hope.
There's now very good science that shows that the sense of not belonging, the sense of lacking self-esteem, raises cortisol levels in your blood. And cortisol is good for you when you're in an extremely stressful situation, but when you're constantly bathed in cortisol, because you're constantly feeling these stressors of being marginalized and being told that you're less worthy, less valuable, and being in constant state of really fear and anxiety, it changes your physiology completely. It makes you more prone to cardiovascular disease. It makes you more prone to diabetes. It makes changes in your brain, which actually makes it more difficult to engage in what we call executive function.
This kind of chronic stress, which is driven by the policies that we've created, is as lethal as any knife or any gun.
Suppose discrimination did end today. How many generations would it take to get to rough equality in wealth across races? Her answer is 7 generations, more than 200 years.
And so when white Americans hear about affirmative action for blacks or for Latinos, they're outraged. They think, I've done this by myself, why can't these people? There's something wrong with these people.
The same programs that were provided to white Americans that enabled them to accumulate this wealth through home ownership, those same opportunities have to be provided to us.
Imagine where minority families would be today if their grandparents had the same access to wealth through home ownership that white families had. What would the wealth gap be between white and minority families if minorities had the same access to wealth through home ownership? Would there be a gap?